The Subcommittee on Immigration and Border Security and the Subcommittee on National Security will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. We welcome our witnesses today. I will recognize myself first for an opening statement. We'll have a series of opening statements given the fact that this is a joint hearing. The administration is moving to lift the longstanding prohibition against Libyans entering the United States to work in aviation, maintenance, flight operations, or to study or train in nuclear-related fields, despite concerns expressed last November by Representative Jason Chaffetz and Chairman Bob Goodlatte. DHS moved forward with this change and sent the draft final regulation to OMB. Under the terms of the regulation, the removal of the prohibition will go into effect without prior notice and comment. We would have to trust the Libyan government and the administration to appropriately vet which Libyans would be allowed to learn to fly planes and study nuclear technology. The current prohibition was put into place in the early 1980s after a series of terrorist incidents involving Libyan nationals. On December 2nd, 1979, a mob attacked and burned the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli, and on December 29, 1979, the United States designated Libya as a state sponsor of terrorism. In order to protect Americans, on March 11, 1983, the Reagan administration implemented this rule to prohibit Libyan nationals or other foreign nationals acting on behalf of a Libyan entity from obtaining certain immigration benefits for the purpose of engaging in or seeking to obtain aviation maintenance, flight operations, or nuclear-related studies or training. While we have hope for a democratic Libya, the question we must consider today is, has enough changed to lift this long-standing ban? Why now? Is post-revolutionary Libya secure enough to justify and warrant the change? And let's consider some recent events. If we will, the National Transitional Council has struggled to govern Libya effectively since the fall of Gaddafi. Majority of territory outside Tripoli has fallen under the control of armed militias that have refused to disarm. Just 3 weeks ago, on March 12, 2014, the Libyan Prime Minister fled after Parliament voted him out of office. Militias based in western Libya, notorious for their violence and independence, have launched an offensive against the eastern rebels in what could be the opening shots in a civil war between western and eastern Libya. Without a central government, without any real power, Libya may be falling apart. Only 2 weeks ago, Libya acknowledged for the first time that terrorist groups were behind dozens of attacks against security services. The government issued a statement on March 19 saying Benghazi and other cities are facing a terrorist war waged by Libyan and foreign elements who have hostile, evil agendas. On March 20th, Libya's government called for international help to fight terrorism that is threatening internal stability in the country. On the same day, a missile was launched at the Tripoli airport runway, shutting down the airport. And finally, the head of Libya's military police was assassinated in Benghazi in October, while Libya's first post-Gaddafi prosecutor general was shot dead on February 8, 2013. Unfortunately, these new reports indicate that the militias are getting stronger and not weaker. So why is the administration proposing to lift a 30-year ban on Libyans coming to the U.S. to train as nuclear scientists now? The administration's draft regulation justifies the change because the U.S. relationship with Libya has been normalized. In November, my colleagues, Representative Chaffetz and Goodlatte, wrote to Acting Homeland Security Secretary Beers about this rule change and spelled out specifically the violent threats and actions against American anti-terrorism operations in the country. And we cannot talk about the Libyan-American relationship without acknowledging the attack against the diplomatic post in Benghazi, resulting in the murder of 4 Americans. How was this relationship normalized when our ambassador was murdered in Benghazi 18 months ago and not one single solitary person has been arrested, prosecuted, or brought to justice? It seems, therefore, unjustifiable to rescind a 30-year rule at this time. Why are we willing to risk, no matter the likelihood, chancing Libyan extremists or terrorists to come here to essentially learn the skills to commit acts of terror? So why in general, and why now specifically? What has changed? And the burden of advocating for change, in my judgment, and the status quo, lies with the administration. With that, I will recognize the ranking member, Ms. Lofgren from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Based on the letters that the majority has sent to the Department of Homeland Security as well as the opening statement, I believe the concerns can be summarized as follows. The Libyan government is fragile. There are extremist elements in the region that would do us harm, so we can't lift the visa restriction because these people might somehow harm us. This argument, however, is illogical. First, as the Department of Defense, which initiated the request to rescind the visa restriction in the first place, makes clear, the whole point of lifting the visa restriction is to help the Libyan government defeat those very extremists. Members on both sides of the aisle, including Republican Senators John McCain, Lindsey Graham, Saxby Chambliss, have recognized the critical importance of helping the new democratically elected Libyan government secure itself against militant extremism in the region. But the visa restrictions actually stand in the way. Because the restriction affects all Libyans, it means we can't even train the pro-Western forces within the Libyan Air Force on the aircraft they need to secure their own country against extremist forces. The Libyan government's ability to fight such forces depends on being able to move troops and equipment throughout the country. And the country currently uses Lockheed C-130 military transport planes and Boeing CH-47 cargo helicopters to do that. But according to the Defense Department, the fleet is aging and needs repair and replacement, and many more pilots and flight crew need to be trained. There are proposals to buy additional aircraft and parts from U.S. companies and to provide training to pilots and flight crew, but the visa restrictions stand in the way of those arrangements. Members on the other side of the aisle may raise the unfortunate attacks in Benghazi at this hearing today, but that event actually underscores why we should lift the visa restriction. On the night of the attack, it was one of those very same Lockheed C-130 transport planes that the Libyan government used to rescue and evacuate the surviving consular personnel at the U.S. compound in Benghazi. Rather than used against us, that plane helped Americans survive. Now, will my colleagues on the other side of the aisle nevertheless raise the Benghazi attack, as well as other terrorist incidents within Libya, as grounds for keeping the visa restriction in place? We must keep in mind that there is a difference between the extremist forces behind these incidents and the pro-Western Libyan military that's trying to defeat them. And that's the point of lifting the visa restriction. Like my majority colleagues, the visa restriction, simply does not differentiate between the Libyan forces we're trying to help and the forces we're trying to defeat. It bars friend and foe alike, and that just isn't smart policy. It gets us to the second big reason why we should rescind the visa restriction. It simply isn't needed to keep America safe from harm. We must bear in mind that the 30-year-old Libyan visa restriction is the only such country-specific visa ban of its kind. It's an anachronistic relic of a bygone era. If a ban were necessary with respect to Libya, which is not designated a state sponsor of terrorism since the Bush administration removed them from the list in 2006, wouldn't it be even more necessary with respect to countries that are actually designated as state sponsors of terrorism? Well, those bans don't exist. There are no country-specific bans for Iran, Syria, Sudan, Cuba, the countries currently listed as state sponsors of terrorism, nor is there a ban for rogue nations like North Korea. And that's because our immigration laws provide plenty of authority to prevent the travel of individuals who pose a danger to the U.S. and its interests. Our immigration laws already require the denial of visas to persons with suspected ties to terrorism, as well as anyone who is otherwise suspected of posing a threat to national security. Our immigration laws also require consular officials to deny visas for an individual whose travel raises significant foreign policy concerns. The same is true for any individual suspected of potentially violating the terms of their visa or admission to the U.S. Over the years, including after the attacks of September 11, 2001, this country has not seen fit to erect more country-specific restrictions like the Libyan visa ban. Instead, the U.S. moved in a very different direction, erecting bans that actually focused on whether the admission of a particular individual was helpful or harmful to U.S. interests. In other words, we adopted policies that allowed us to let in our friends and to keep out our enemies rather than barring them all. Doesn't that make more sense? But Unfortunately, sense is rarely what congressional hearings are about these days, and I'm afraid we will see potentially some scare tactics and political attacks on the administration. I hope not. I hope that my fear is not grounded. I do thank the witnesses for joining us today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Before we go vote and come back, I would ask unanimous consent to put a couple of things in the record. Number one, Libya final regulation, final action notice from the Secretary of DHS, Janet Napolitano, former Secretary of DHS. February 1st, 2010 letter to Assistant Secretary Heyman from Assistant Secretary Jeffrey Feltman. May 31st, 2012 letter to Assistant Secretary Heyman from Assistant Secretary Jeffrey Feltman. February 12th, 2013 action memo from Mr. Burson to DHS. April 1st, 2014 letter to Mr. Burson from Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Amanda Dory. March 21st, 2014 letter to Chairman Goodlatte and myself from Brian D. Valance, Acting Secretary for Legislative Affairs at DHS. And finally, information from an OMB showing the date the regulation was sent to them and that the review was extended. I need to read this. Because the Freedom of Information Act and the Privacy Act include explicit exemptions for disclosure to Congress, members and staff of the House are not restricted in their use of the information provided by DHS. As is typical, the speech and debate clause also applies in this context. With that, I want to apologize to our witnesses. I'm asking unanimous, well, I did ask unanimous consent. Is there an objection from the gentleman from Utah? No. Okay. So admitted. I will apologize to the four witnesses. We will vote as quickly as we can, and then we will come back and recognize the remainder of our colleagues for their opening statements, and then you for yours. And with that, we are temporarily recessed. committee will come to order, and the chair will now recognize the subcommittee chair from Oversight, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman, and I thank you all for being here today on this topic. I simply don't understand who in the federal government wakes up in the morning and says, you know, what's in the best interest of the United States, what would improve the national security posture of the United States is to make sure that Libyan nationals can come to the United States and learn about nuclear sciences. That we got to teach them about aviation. Like, who actually wakes up in this country and says, this would be in the best interest of the United States of America. Let's teach the Libyan nationals about nuclear sciences. That makes no sense to me. None. Now, I'm sure there are a lot of good and decent people there. They're going through a lot of difficult things, but it does not mean that we should be actively pursuing the bringing of Libyan nationals to the United States to train them on nuclear sciences. We've got enough Americans that can do this. And as it relates to aviation security and aviation, we can teach them overseas. We don't need to bring them to the United States of America to do this, where we don't monitor them once they're here. I was very surprised to read the department's draft final regulation, Building Code 9111-28, that stated, quote, DHS has determined that maintaining this regulation would no longer reflect current U.S. government policy towards Libya, end quote. I'm curious to hear what exactly the administration's current government policy towards Libya entails. Of all the things in the world we got to do and work on, this is what the administration is working on? How to loosen up the visa requirements for Libyan nationals to come to the United States? Equally troubling to me was reading Mr. Burson's memorandum addressed to then DHS Secretary Janet Napolitano on February 12, 2013. In his memo, Mr. Burson recommended that the Secretary take regulatory action to rescind Section 214.5 of Title 8 of the Code of Federal Regulations. What's most surprising is that the memo postdates the tragic day in Benghazi when our country lost 4 Americans during a terrorist attack. We couldn't even send our FBI into eastern Libya for 18 days because it was so dangerous. We couldn't get the intelligence that we needed. We couldn't even get the FBI to go into that part of the country. And yet we want to give those same people a visa to come to the United States to learn about nuclear sciences? Wow. However, not one mention of the chaos and violence in Libya is made in the memo. There appears to be zero consideration of any geopolitical concern in rescinding this 31-year-old rule that prohibits certain Libyan nationals from engaging in aviation or nuclear-related training in the United States. Meanwhile, just last month it was reported that the Libyan former Prime Minister, Ali Zidane, fled after Parliament voted him out of office. A North Korean oil tanker illegally picked up a cargo of crude from rebels in eastern Libya, despite a Libyan government's threat to detain the vessel. In western Libya, militias launched attacks against eastern Libya rebels, which could provoke a civil war. These events do not indicate a nation where things have been quote-unquote normalized. Rather, they have seemed to be ingredients of a failed state in the making. Another reason why the department's rescission of this prohibition in the CFR is so troubling is the lack of any prior notice or comment period. That is a deep concern. I have read the testimonies of the witnesses, and it seems they were all in agreement. Libya is a very dangerous place, challenged by instability. And we're looking at corruption indexes. Libya ranks 172 out of 177, making it the 6th most corrupt country in the world, if you're going to believe that index. I was in Libya in September of 2012. I was in Libya again in November of 2013. I heard firsthand the security challenges of the country. I met with the deputy prime minister, who noted that the security situation in Libya is tumultuous at best. He referred to his government as an accidental government. It was the byproduct of removing an existing government. And he claimed one of the main obstacles to their progress was a police force, was the lack of a reliable Ministry of Interior, Intelligence, and Internal Affairs apparatus to help the police force. When we go to give somebody a visa, we rely on the host nation to help us identify that person and understand their background. That does not happen in Libya. Let's be realistic. Muammar Gaddafi was ruling there for 40 plus years. They don't have the infrastructure and the ability to deal with this. Now, there were some assertions early on in the testimony that Well, we need to train them on aviation. Well, then do it overseas. That's how we've done it in the past. There was this assertion that there is no prohibition against getting visas from state sponsors of terrorism in other countries. I want to sponsor that bill. It's a good idea. I'm going to sponsor a bill that says if you're trying to get a visa from a state sponsor of terrorists, then you shouldn't be able to get a visa here in the United States. And there are multiple restrictions on Cuba, Mongolia, North Korea, Vietnam, the People's Republic of China, for all sorts of different visas. We have these types of visa restrictions in Iran for people trying to come from Iran. So there is precedent. I don't see, Mr. Chairman, the reason why we have to deal with this now, and I'm glad to have this hearing. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Utah. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank our witnesses for being here today as well. I'm going to ask unanimous consent to enter my opening statement in its entirety into the official record and make just a couple of brief remarks. First, we're all
Without objection.
Thank you. We're having a review of the attempt to define the bilateral relationship between our country and Libya. And both before and after the fall of Mr. Gaddafi, the Department of Defense espoused the need to lift the restrictions that we're discussing. In view of Libya's challenges in building and stabilizing democratic institutions, it seems advisable that we review whether or not the success of that country in transitioning has impacted its ability to meet national security requirements in a manner that strengthens or weakens the development of its armed forces and political process. Everybody agrees that there's greater political uncertainty now than there was perhaps in 2012, but if the Department of Defense security experts feel that military cooperation is a good idea, if they think it would help stabilize the government, then it would seem to make sense to me that we have the Department of Defense and their defense experts here to discuss whether or not the current political infrastructure is secure enough and reliable enough to warrant the cooperation that's being recommended. And I just think that's one of the faults of today's hearing, is we don't seem to have a full panoply of people that are making the recommendation, which I think would make ultimate sense, and therefore the committee members are not going to get a full discussion of this matter, and I regret that. With that, I'll rely on the rest of my statement that's been entered upon the record, and thank the chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair would now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, the past chairman of the full committee, Mr. Conyers.
Thank you, Chairman, and we welcome Mr. Tierney to our ranks. I would like to make this observation, if I may, namely that the Department of Defense had asked the State Department and the Department of Homeland Security to rescind a dated 30-year-old regulation that is currently hindering U.S. interests in Libya. That regulation, which prevents Libyan nationals and certain other individuals from coming to the United States to study flight operations, aircraft maintenance, and nuclear science, was put in place in 1983 when Libya had training camps and supported terrorism around the world. Such a prohibition on visas for the Libyan nationals may have made sense in 1983, but it does not make sense over 30 years later. If country-specific travel bans were necessary to keep us safe, we would have instituted them for other countries, like designated state sponsors of terrorism, Iran, Cuba, Syria, or Sudan, and other countries, like North Korea, but we haven't. That's because our immigration laws provide broad authority to restrict travel to individuals who may do us harm. The government already denies admission to anyone suspected of having ties to terrorism, anyone suspected of otherwise posing a threat to national security, anyone whose travel raises significant foreign policy concerns, and even anyone suspected of potentially violating the terms of their visa or admission to the United States. This kind of system basically allows us to keep in the good guys and keep out the bad guys. It is far superior to a system like the Libyan regulation that keeps out friend or foe alike. Libya and our relationship with Libya has changed dramatically since the regulation was promulgated in 1983. In the late 1990s, Libya became an ally in the war against terrorism. In the years following, Libya condemned the 9/11 attacks against the United States, paid compensation for attacks it had been responsible for in the past, destroyed and surrendered its weapons of mass destruction, signed international treaties and protocols on non-proliferation, and otherwise sought to return to the good graces of the international community. For these actions, the administration of former President George W. Bush ended sanctions against Libya in 2004. In 2006, President Bush and Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice removed Libya from the list of state-sponsored sponsors of terrorism. Secretary Rice even said that the United States was resuming, quote, normal diplomatic relations, end quotation, with Libya. Based on those improving relations, the Department of Defense, not known for being soft on terrorism, requested that the Libyan regulation be rescinded. Libya's ability to fight off extremist forces in the region and the Arab Spring and the Libyan Civil War put efforts to lift the Libyan regulation on hold. But once Libya established a new democratically elected government, one that sought closer cooperation with the United States, the Defense Department renewed its request to lift the visa restriction. The principal reason for lifting the restriction is to help the Libyan government fight a common enemy, extremist militants in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, this is critical. A few months ago, Senator John McCain went to Libya and explained the critical importance of training the Libyan armed forces. He said, and I quote, "I have met with the military here, and we are confident that we have plans now for training and equipment for the Libyan military," end quotation. Senator McCain noted that this support was critical for helping the Libyan armed forces carry out their security and border management tasks critical to beating the extremist forces in the region. But the current visa restriction prevents us from providing a great deal of this training and equipment, thus making it more likely that the extremists may win. I doubt that this is the outcome anyone here wants, and I thank the witnesses for joining us here today for this discussion, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman from Michigan. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Goodlatte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and Chairman Chaffetz for holding this hearing. On February 1, 2010, then Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, Jeffrey Feltman, requested ending the long-standing prohibition against Libyans entering the United States to work in aviation maintenance, flight operations, or to study or train in nuclear-related fields. Shortly thereafter, widespread unrest in Libya precluded the U.S. government from engagement with Libya. The post-Arab Spring civil war in Libya led to the fall of the Gaddafi regime in August 2011, and Gaddafi was captured and then killed by rebel forces in October 2011. Following the revolution, the Obama administration once again began the process of, quote, normalizing relations with that country. Yet on September 11, 2012, U.S. Ambassador John Christopher Stevens and 3 other State Department officials were killed when terrorists stormed the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya, and set it ablaze. A statement by U.S. State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland said the United States condemned the attack, quote, in the strongest terms, end quote, and was working with Libyan security forces to secure the compound. President Obama called the attack in Benghazi outrageous and shocking and vowed its perpetrators will face justice. Quote, I've also directed my administration to increase our security at diplomatic posts around the world, Obama said, and make no mistake, we will work with the Libyan government to bring to justice the killers who attacked our people, end quote. To date, no one has been brought to justice for these attacks. Instead, and despite these attacks, on May 31, 2012, Feltman, along with Joseph McMillan, Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, again asked DHS to end the prohibition, stating the, quote, outdated regulation does not reflect current U.S. government policy towards Libya, end quote. Unbelievably, the letter makes no mention of the attacks, acting as if they had never occurred. Rather, as outlined in a February 12, 2013 memo from Alan Burson, signed by Secretary Napolitano, quote, according to the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli, there is a robust plan in place to encourage engagement and educational exchanges in coming years with the Libyan government. The Department of Defense is attempting to initiate a program of aircraft sales, pilot training, and ground crew training early this year worth $2 billion, the contracts for which would go to other countries if training could not be conducted in the United States. The Departments of Defense and State have made it clear that absent its rescission, the regulation will significantly hamper these efforts, end quote. On April 1, 2014, just 2 days before this hearing, the Department of Defense reiterated its desire to see the regulation lifted to Mr. Burson. The memo from Mr. Burson also fails to mention the attack in Benghazi, the first time an ambassador for the United States had been killed since 1979. The long-standing prohibition on Libyans was put in place to protect the homeland against serious threats from terrorists from a particularly unstable and dangerous country. The Obama administration argues that it is no longer needed. However, many of the characteristics regarding Libya that caused the regulation to be put in place persist today. Regardless of any progress that may have been made following the removal of Muammar Gaddafi from power, many extremist and terrorist groups operate unfettered in Libya. 2 weeks ago, Libya acknowledged for the first time that terrorist groups were behind dozens of attacks against security forces. And on March 20th, Libya's government called for international help to fight terrorism that is threatening internal stability in that country. That same day, a missile was launched at the Tripoli airport. 4 9/11 hijacker pilots obtained their expertise in aviation, primarily at U.S. flight schools. Do we want to risk Libyan terrorists learning how to fly airplanes in the United States? Given the desire of radical regimes and terrorists to obtain or build nuclear weapons or dirty bombs, do we want to possibly train Libyan terrorists in nuclear engineering? If the prohibition is lifted, not only can Libyans supposedly vetted by the administration receive this training, but any Libyan can seek to do so. Ultimately, it does not appear that national security has been adequately considered in the effort to end the prohibition. It is uncertain whether our immigration system has sufficient integrity to ferret out applicants' long-term motivations for receiving an education in sensitive topics from the United States. As a final note, we have long been seeking information from the Department of Homeland Security regarding the status of the rescission of the regulation and the role of the White House. We only received answers to some of the questions we asked after this hearing was announced. It is troubling that it takes such actions by the committees to receive information from DHS that is vital for us to fulfill our legitimate oversight role. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the chairman. We have a distinguished panel of witnesses. I'm going to do my best to summarize and capture your backgrounds. If I leave something out, it's not because it's not important, it's because I'm trying to get you out of here at a reasonable hour. We have your opening statements and then questions. I'm going to introduce you en banc, and then I will recognize you individually for your opening statements, and hope that you do a better job than I did at staying within the 5-minute time period. The lights mean what they normally mean. Green means go, yellow means speed up, and red means stop. First, Mr. Alan Burson currently serves as Assistant Secretary of International Affairs and Chief Diplomatic Officer for the Department of Homeland Security, a position he has held since January of 2012. He oversees the Department's international engagement and serves as the Principal Advisor to Secretary Jay Johnson on all international affairs. Previously, he was the Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. He's graduated from Harvard, Oxford, and Yale, where he got a law degree. Ms. Janice Kephart, if I mispronounce your name, forgive me, currently serves as CEO of Secure Identity and Biometrics Association, a firm that works to create awareness and promote the value of secure identity technologies and biometric solutions. She also recently returned from a special counsel position with the Senate Judiciary Committee. Prior to that, she was counsel to the 9/11 Commission and was the author of 9/11 and Terrorist Travel. She holds degrees from Duke and Villanova School of Law. Mr. James Chaparro is Executive Vice President for Strategy at Strategic Enterprise Solutions, an information technology services and management consulting company that delivers cybersecurity technology and program management capabilities to better enable the government to accomplish their mission. Prior to that, he had a distinguished 26-year-long career in federal law enforcement and the national intelligence community. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science from California State University, Long Beach, and a graduate of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. Dr. Frederick Weary is Senior Associate in the Middle East Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His research focuses on political reform and security issues in the Arab Gulf states, Libya, and U.S. policy in the Middle East. Prior to that, he was Senior Policy Analyst at the RAND Corporation. He's also a Lieutenant Colonel in the U.S. Air Force Reserve, completed tours in Turkey, Uganda, Libya, Algeria, and Iraq, where he earned the Bronze Star in 2003. We thank you for your service. He holds an MA in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton and a PhD in International Relations from Oxford. With that, we would recognize Mr. Burson for his 5-minute opening statement.
Chairman Goodlatte, Gowdy, Chaffetz, Ranking Members Conyers, Lofgren, and Tierney, I want to assure you that we have not approached the subject of today's hearing without careful consideration. Secretary Napolitano considered it carefully, as is Secretary Johnson, who is taking great care to review this important issue. I share your commitment to the safety and security of our nation, and I would never undertake any measure that would place this country in jeopardy. I have never awakened on any morning with the intent to do so. My entire public career and public life is to the contrary. Ladies and gentlemen, we have good reasons and prudent ones for changing this regulation, and I want to ensure you are comfortable with our thinking, or that at least you understand the basis for the recommendation. I'm also available to discuss this issue with you individually. Today, I'd like to discuss why this is a sound policy from the standpoint of ensuring that we are issuing visas appropriately and safely admitting those whom we allow to enter the country in accordance with congressional mandates that have been established after 9/11. In 2013, the Department of Homeland Security, under then Secretary Napolitano, agreed to formal request by the Departments of State and Defense to begin the process to amend a provision from 1983, barring Libyan nationals seeking to study aviation maintenance, flight operations, or nuclear-related fields in the United States. It is important to note, as has the ranking members, that 8 CFR Section 214.5 applies only to Libyan nationals or other foreign nationals acting on behalf of a Libyan entity. There are no other DHS regulations similarly restricting nationals of other countries, including those that today remain state sponsors of terrorism. Much has changed since 1983. The most important change is that we suffered the attack of 9/11, and after that trauma, Congress legislated a whole series of security requirements in response. Notably, Congress did not adopt the technique embodied in 214.5 of banning nationals of this country or that country. Instead, Congress adopted a case-by-case approach to be filtered through multiple layers and checks, which is what we have proceeded to accomplish over the last 13 years. As a result, distinguished members, the U.S. government has exponentially expanded procedures for vetting immigrants, refugees, and visa applicants. Today, our vetting process considers a far broader range of information than it ever has, and certainly did in 1983 or in the years before 9/11. In the absence of 8 CFR 214.5, Libyan visa applicants seeking admission to the United States for any purpose, to include aviation and nuclear-related training, would be subject to the array of visa security measures currently in place to protect U.S. borders from terrorist-related or other illicit travel. Each year, 365 people cross our borders to visit this country for one purpose or another. Every one of them is subject to the restrictions and the layers of security that I look forward to discussing with you this afternoon. Interagency stakeholders, to include DHS, the Department of State, the FBI, the National Counterterrorism Center, and other intelligence community partners, have constructed a visa vetting process that leverages state-of-the-art technology, extensive information sharing, highly skilled and trained officers, and comprehensive interagency cooperation, all to facilitate legitimate trade and travel without compromising our nation's security. The Security Advisory Opinion Mechanism is an interagency secondary screening process available to consular officers to provide supplementary advice and background information to adjudicate cases of visa applicants with possible terrorism or other security-related ineligibilities. Specific to the nuclear-related provision of 214.5, Libyan visa applicants would be subject to a specific type of security advisory opinion known as visas mantis. The purpose of visas mantis is to ensure comprehensive interagency vetting to guard against improper technology transfers. Initially in 2010 and then in 2012, the Departments of State and Defense formally requested that DHS rescind 214.5 to allow for comprehensive bilateral security with the Libyan government. I want to discuss with you today, and I look forward to doing so, why we at DHS felt that that would not jeopardize the security of this nation or the safety of the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Person. Ms. Kephart.
Good afternoon, Chairman Goodlett, Chairman Chaffetz, Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Conyers, Ranking Member Lofgren, Ranking Member Tierney, and distinguished members of the subcommittees. To be clear, I am not representing the views of the Secure Identity and Biometrics Association today, an organization I founded in February. I understand that DOD, DOE, and DOS all have strategic reasons for wanting the Libyan visa ban on aviation and nuclear studies lifted, and that military and diplomatic agreements are the usual course of business for the United States. However, when the immigration system is affected in such a contract, such situations must be treated with careful consideration. The immigration system is more than a token in a contract, but a gateway to our great benefits and a core strategic partner in security. As such, I deeply appreciate Mr. Bernson's testimony. He has illuminated much in major improvements to visa processing that support what we learned on the 9/11 Commission and since that time. Unfortunately, there is more than just process at stake in rescinding this rule. Remember, there is absolutely nothing in place legally when this rule is rescinded. No processing requirements, no caveats, no limits on only DOD-endorsed individuals having access to these visas, for example. Visas mandates for high science visas like nuclear studies is discretionary. Flight school vetting for DoD-endorsed individuals will be waived. And we know the security concerns here are widely understood because of the 9/11 hijacker pilots who obtained their expertise in aviation primarily at U.S. flight schools. Kingfisher counterterrorism automated vetting is not clearly required. Patriot vetting by ICE officers is not fully in place yet, and we don't even know if it would apply to Libya. Any Libyan and any militia that is threatening the Libyan government right now, Al-Qaeda or numerous dangerous elements in Libya, could apply that our intelligence simply can't pick up where there are so many degrees of anti-U.S. sentiment. While I personally don't think it's the right time for rescission, the foreign policy questions are for this body and the administration to jointly decide. What I want to do with the remainder of my time is pose some areas that deserve further consideration. Let me begin with the sensitive and dual-use technologies. Current law requires that nations actively sending their citizens to study nuclear and other sciences will not use that knowledge to increase a region's instability, for one, or two, develop and transfer arms or sensitive technologies to terrorists. In Libya, we've got both issues of concern. The region and the government are highly unstable, and the Libyan government could end up transferring sensitive technologies to terrorists under a lot of different scenarios. The 1983 rule under consideration today requires that no detrimental security situation be implicated, but rescission will repeal that standard too. Also, why does Libya want these students in the U.S. really? With a $2 billion military contract at stake, will these state-sponsored students have to work for the Libyan government, and in what capacity? Historically, for example, Iraq's strategy was to send students specifically to study nuclear-related subjects in order to develop Iraq's non-conventional weapons programs. One of these students received his doctorate in nuclear engineering from Michigan State University, returned to Iraq to head its nuclear weapons program. Similarly, at least 3 Iranian officials suspected of developing Tehran's nuclear program also reportedly studied in the United States. Libya sent students to develop Tripoli's weapons program prior to Gaddafi's fall. In 2012, we banned Iranians from obtaining nuclear and energy-related visas. The precedent set in 2012 represents not creating a detrimental security situation, which could be very well preserved in the current rule. And what do we really know about the individual Libyan applicants in a nation being torn by internal terrorist activity? For both nuclear and aviation applicants, it's unclear whether the administration's self-created interview waiver pilot program could apply to applicants under this rule. You may recall that the visa interview played a major role in our 9/11 Commission recommendations and findings. The interview pilot program enables the waiver of interviews deemed in the national interest, and there is the possibility that the national interest exception could apply to some of these Libyans. The result could be not great security vetting nor interviews for certain Libyans. In conclusion, there's no doubt that this rule could detrimentally provide access for Libyans to highly desired nuclear and aviation visas. However, if there is a decision to do so, I highly recommend limiting access of these visas to the original DoD request in the contract, mandating interviews, mandating security advisory opinions, and alien flight school program vetting, which is not mandated, and use the student tracking to its utmost potential, and enforce immigration law where appropriate. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Chaparro.
Chairman Goodlatte, Chairman Gowdy, Chairman Chaffetz, and Ranking Members Lofgren, Tierney, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to discuss DHS's proposed rescission of 8 CFR 214.5. I have spent over 2.5 decades of my professional career strengthening national security in a number of key positions. I have served as a frontline special agent with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the director of anti-smuggling at INS, a special agent in charge with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the director of the Human Smuggling and Trafficking Center, executive associate director for enforcement and removal operations at ICE, deputy undersecretary for intelligence at DHS INA, and executive vice president at SC Solutions. My experience provides me with a deep understanding of threats and vulnerabilities impacting Homeland Security. I understand how our legitimate travel systems are continually exploited by those seeking to circumvent our security efforts, and I also understand the strengths and weaknesses of our IT systems that vet visitors as well as our enforcement capabilities, strengths, and weaknesses. I am extremely proud of the men and women who labor around the clock and around the globe to help protect us. I understand their challenges firsthand, and I feel a burning sense of urgency to help them. Once a state sponsor of terrorism with an aggressive WMD program, Libya is working hard to evolve to accepted norms of international conduct and governance. Despite the best efforts of Libya's weak and unstable government, Libya remains a very dangerous place. Radical extremists within Libya, including factions of al-Qaeda, continue to present genuine threats to Libya's security and to our own. Libya's ineffective border controls cannot stem the illicit flow of people and weapons across its borders. In fact, the UN Security Council issued a statement last December urging the Libyan government to gain control of the vast amounts of unsecured weapons in Libya, citing the risks of having those weapons fall into the hands of extremist groups. I commend the subcommittees for holding this hearing. While it is clearly in America's interest to strengthen relations with Libya, it is also in our interest to protect our own citizens at home. Rescinding 214.5 begs several questions. Does Libya have sufficient passport issuance controls, including effective anti-corruption measures? Can Libya control its own borders to stem the flow of terrorists and weapons? Does Libya have the capability to conduct comprehensive background and security checks before it issues passports? Are the breeder documents used to issue Libyan passports secure? And then looking at our own mechanisms, how effective are our own border security screening tools? We have made progress, but we have gaps. How effective are we at monitoring the compliance of foreign students in the U.S.? Have we provided sufficient resources to maintain acceptable levels of compliance? And have we implemented effective deterrence for those who fail to comply? How effective are our IT systems at pushing that necessary information to our frontline officers and agents? The GAO has found considerable room for improvement in many of our border security programs, including CVIP, which is designed to monitor compliance of foreign students. DHS, as Mr. Burson noted, has made tremendous advancements in screening foreign nationals coming into the U.S., including the collection and analysis of biometrics information, federated search tools, targeting algorithms, and increased information sharing. But these tools are not a panacea. The tools have improved, but funds have been cut in operational programs such as Homeland Security investigations and enforcement and removal operations, who are our boots on the ground actually enforcing the law and pursuing the leads that these tools generate. For example, when I was running intelligence at ICE, the Department of Defense was bringing in Afghan nationals to the United States for military training to support the Afghan military. And about once a week, one of them would abscond, which causes great concern because many had training in explosives or training in weapons and tactics. And so my point is that these are very resource-intensive operations. My 2.5 decades of training experience has taught me that when it comes to the safety and security of the American people, we should err on the side of caution. I would rather explain to the Libyan government why we want a little more time to deliberate this important policy matter rather than sit before this committee at some point in the future explaining something that went horribly wrong. I wouldn't feel comfortable lifting the ban until we were satisfied with our answers to these questions. And I know and recognize it's a complex issue. I thank you for inviting me to testify, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Weary.
Chairman Gowdy and Chavez, Ranking Member Lofgren and Tierney, distinguished committee members, I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak with you today about Libya's security. 214.5 is necessary to give the United States the flexibility to assist the Libyan government in its difficult transition. I visited Libya 4 times since the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, traveling to this country's main cities, including Benghazi. I've spoken with a range of government officials, military officers, Islamists, and militia leaders about the lack of security and what to do about it. Now, prior to this, as an officer in the Air Force Reserve, I served as a military attaché at the Defense Attaché Office in Tripoli in 2009, and again in 2011 before the revolution. Based on this service and my visits, I'll offer some observations about why U.S. assistance to Libya's military, especially in the aviation field, is so important for the country's security. Now, much of Libya's hope in bringing about a durable peace to its citizens lies in national reconciliation, a constitution, a functioning parliament, and a government that can deliver services to its citizens. These are challenges where outsiders can assist by offering advice and modest assistance, but the ultimate burden must be carried by Libya's leaders and its civil society. The security field is an area where Libya's government has sought outside help and where the U.S. is well positioned to assist. Libya desperately needs a capable military and a police to assert control of vast expanses of its territory and confront extremists bent on destabilizing the country and its neighbors. During my last trip to Benghazi in November, I was struck by the poor state of Libyan military units in that city. Ill-equipped and lacking even basic body armor and secure communications, they are often indistinguishable from local Islamist militias. Aviation is an especially important part of the effort to bolster security across the country. But the Libyan Air Force is currently unable to perform even basic missions. Long neglected by Gaddafi, its aircraft are poorly maintained, flight training is inadequate, and crashes are common. The Libyan Air Force lacks the critical capacity to ferry equipment and personnel from one part of the country to another. Now, in response to a request by the Libyan government, the U.S. has committed to train and equip a new Libyan national army, denoted in military terms as a, quote, general purpose force. Equipping Libya's military with new lift and mobility aircraft, such as the C-130 and CH-47, is an essential element in the U.S. plan to help Libya secure its territory and confront extremism. So, too, is training a new generation of Libyan pilots in a secure U.S. location with adequate facilities and simulators. Training in Libya is unfeasible due to security conditions and the lack of facilities. CFR 214.5 stands in the way of this assistance. Now, certainly the effort to build Libya's military faces challenges and difficulties. U.S. support to the Libyan military must be undertaken in a way that does not further polarize or destabilize the country. The U.S. must ensure that it trains a force that is respectful of human rights and subordinate to a democratically elected government. But to meet these challenges, the Department of Defense has to have the flexibility to meet Libya's security assistance needs. Mr. Chairman, let me conclude with a few words about Islamic extremism and the influence of al-Qaeda in Libya. Some observers have charged that the Libyan government has grown hostile to the United States and is under the sway of hardline Islamists. Much of this commentary is unfortunately based on a superficial reading of Libya's complex politics. Certainly there are pockets of Libyan territory that are ripe for exploitation by local jihadists working with transnational al-Qaeda elements. But I want to emphasize that these actors remain on the fringes of Libya's politics and its security institutions. Overwhelmingly, the country's Islamists reject violence for political means. Like most other Libyans, they remain committed to moving the country forward on a democratic path, and they welcome cooperation with the United States, provided it is done in a way that is respectful of Libyan sovereignty and built on a foundation of mutual trust. Mr. Chairman, the repeal of CFR 214.5 will help build that trust. It will pave the way for the U.S. to provide vital aviation assistance to Libya's military. It is a small but important step in enabling the country's elected government to protect its citizens and territory, combat violent extremism, and advance the hard-won gains of its revolution. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you here today.
Thank you, sir. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Virginia, the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Goodlatte, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burson, can you give us some more details about the $2 billion contract that you believe is at stake here?
Mr. Chairman, the $2 billion figure that you quoted in from the memorandum was the information that best information we'd received from the State Department, the Defense Department, at the time that the memorandum was composed. As you've seen from the letter filed in connection with this hearing, that number has been reduced based on the assessment of what assistance could be available to Libya
Where was this assistance coming from?
from the United States.
So we would be paying the Libyans to come here and be trained, not generating additional work from outside the country, additional resources to pay people in the United States to provide these services.
I believe the reference in the letter dated April 1st related to hardware. And I'm not familiar with the budget lines that would separate between hardware that would be purchased and supplied and services that might be involved. I'm simply not able to do that, although I'm certain the Pentagon could.
Now, you issued a memo to Secretary Napolitano advocating for rescission of the rule that bars Libyan nationals from entering the United States. The memo you sent to Napolitano fails to discuss the attacks on the U.S. compound in Benghazi, does not discuss recent terror threats coming out of Libya, or the instability of the current Libyan government. Do you think that any event would change the administration's mind about rescinding the rule when the death of a U.S. ambassador did not, and very heavy terrorist activity inside Libya right now does not seem to change that?
Mr. Chairman, and respectfully, the attachments to the memorandum that was submitted with my memorandum to Secretary Napolitano did mention the tragic, horrible, and unspeakably indefensible attack on our compound in
The
Benghazi.
attachments, but not the memo itself. So in the memo, you did not address those concerns. Why would that be?
Because the issue that we were addressing was the request of the Defense Department and the State Department made to engage with those elements of Libya, the Libyan government, with whom we could do business and who would be able to take actions that would be in the interest of the United States. The focus of our request, because that's a policy judgment that was recommended by State and Defense, and we did not take issue with it, but the focus of our concern was on how we would issue visas and what protections existed to be able to assure that we could do so securely and safely.
But isn't it true that if the regulation was lifted, there would be nothing in place to prevent any Libyan from seeking access to the United States for purposes of flight training or to study nuclear science?
They could, as is the case from, with the exception of Iran, from other citizens of sponsors of state terrorism, in which there is no specific or overall ban, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I don't want to get into other countries that we might want to add to that list, but I certainly don't have a problem associating what's going on in Libya today with the same kind of concerns we have with what's going on in Iran today, and why we would want to reduce that list in a country that's having the kind of problems it is disturbing to me.
The ability to enlist and recruit those people who are known to our military and to our diplomats, and to be able to distinguish between them and terrorists, I think is a fundamental assumption here that is a good assumption.
Why didn't you modify the regulation to provide that only Libyans vetted by the U.S. military could seek to do these things? Why do you repeal the entire regulation?
Because of the system of vetting and the layers of security that exist, Mr. Chairman, we have confidence that we do this every day and that we could do this in this case. And with respect to the specific areas of flight maintenance and operations and nuclear-related fields, there are extra layers of security and vetting through which everyone who would be
my time's
invited
running
into the
out,
country would go through.
Let me turn to Ms. Kephart and ask her what she thinks about this. Do you agree with me that there is nothing that would prevent any Libyan from seeking access to the United States for purposes of flight training or studying nuclear science?
That's correct.
The State Department recently updated their security vetting procedures to include a new system called Kingfisher. The system was up and running for non-immigrant visas as of June 15, 2013, and functions for immigrant visas as of the first week of September of last year. The notice to rescind the regulation makes no mention whatsoever of Kingfisher, though the rescission notice was sent to OMB on January 1, 2014. Isn't it crucial to ensure that Kingfisher processing is required for all Libyans seeking to study aviation or nuclear science?
I agree, and I would also add that right now, under the draft language supporting the final rule rescission, everything, all the other security vetting is discretionary as well. There's mention of visa manus for nuclear science, but it's not required. There's mention of the alien flight student program, but that's waived for DoD applicants. So, you know, you've got some loopholes in there that are pretty big. And I think, and Patriot also is not mentioned either, the visa security vetting as well. So I think these are all really great measures that, if they're in place, would help a lot with this particular rule, but it's not even mentioned. And having it discretionary leaves too many loopholes, in my view.
My time's expired. Thank you, Ms. Kephart. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair will now recognize the gentlelady from California, the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Lofgren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's the Department of Defense that's really driving this proposal, as best I can figure, and the letter that has been put into the record makes it clear that the Defense Department believes it's important to actually get this changed so they can strengthen the Western forces in the Libyan government. Now, I asked my staff to check with the Defense Department to understand why, in the department's view, it's important to train Libyan officials in the United States. And if we assume that it's important, and I think everyone does, that we strengthen Western forces, I don't think anybody's against doing that, why would we have to do it here? Now, what we were told is that the training that would normally be done for, let's talk about the pilots, has to be done under secure conditions, and that the simulators and training facilities that meet those security requirements are really only here, and that if the travel ban continues, the Defense Department would have to establish secure training facilities someplace else, which they haven't done and they don't have the budget to do, and or the material to do. Is that your understanding? I guess I should ask you, Dr. Weary, is that your understanding, kind of what the crux of the problem is here?
Yes, ma'am. There's really no facilities to do it. Obviously, in Libya, they're in disrepair, security conditions, so it would have to be done in the United States or at a third country. I mean, I visited some of these air bases, and there's just no place. There's no infrastructure, and then of course the security issue.
Now, Secretary Burson, obviously all of us want to have a safe country. We don't want anybody who would do harm to the United States to be admitted to the United States. There's no disagreement on that point, I don't think, among any member of the committee. The concerns that have been raised about our ability to adequately vet prospective Libyan trainees, I think needs to be addressed directly. Do you think that the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security can adequately screen who we want to receive the training in the United States? Are we up to that task, do you think?
Ms. Lofgren, yes, and in addition to that, there's the combined resources of the intelligence community, the National Counterterrorism Center, and the FBI and the Department of Justice.
Now, can you explain the process that DHS would use to screen out potential bad actors from Libya who might want to come and receive training here but really they're not our side? How would you address that?
In two specific ways. First is the standard visa vetting process that takes place with regard to all foreigners who enter the United States, and that involves being checked against massive databases that are maintained by the United States government. These include the automated biometric identification system containing 160 million of fingerprints, the FBI Next Generation identification system, which contains 76 million criminal records, the consular consolidated database maintained by the State Department that has 109 million photos of visa applicants, the consular lookout and support system that contains 27 million records of people who have applied for and been rejected for visas, In addition, Ranking Member Lofgren, there is the Terrorist Screening Center activities in which we are constantly screening visa applicants against to rule out people of high risk. That's just at the front end. With regard to specific people who would be applying to flight maintenance schools or flight operations schools, there's a special Transportation Security Administration a security check that would both validate the schools to which they applied, as well as an additional security check based on biometric and biographic information. With regard to those who would be seeking to participate in nuclear-related fields, there is a special program called the Visas Mantis program,
Right.
which would involve very specific vetting and a security advisory opinion that is geared specifically to that. After people would come to the United States, there would be a monitoring of their activities through the SEVIS program,
Right.
the Student and
That's pretty
Exchange Visitor
effective.
program.
Yeah.
And there are other layers of security I'd be happy to go into.
Well, I think, I see my time's expired. I will just mention something I mentioned to the chairman, that years ago, when I was a practitioner, before this ban was in place, I had occasion to meet someone from Libya who had a postdoctoral degree in nuclear physics, and he was getting offers from all over the world, I mean, for his own lab to go develop nuclear programs for other countries, and the Defense Department was quite interested that he not go to those other countries, and we ended up getting a national interest waiver so that that Libyan could not leave the country, and eventually did become an American and became an employee of the Department of Defense. So it's important that we have our friends here, and blanket decisions will not allow us to make those kind of fine decisions. I mean, for example, the idea of doing a blanket prohibition on visas to Syria. I mean, we've got Christians who are fleeing Syria and who are seeking refuge in the United States. Surely we don't want to turn those people away. So I think it's important to use our decision-making in a way that serves American interests.
Ms. Lofgren, if I might, the Congress itself made that decision in the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act of 2002, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when restrictions on issuance of visas to non-immigrants from countries that are state sponsors of international terrorism did not go to the ban as a technique, but rather insisted that there be judgments made case by case, visa by visa, before entering it. So this is defined the way in which we approach this matter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired.
I thank the gentlelady from California, and the chair would now recognize the gentleman from Utah, the chairman of the OGR subcommittee, Mr. Chaffetz.
Thank the chairman. Mr. Burson, what is the driving need to have a Libyan national trained on nuclear sciences?
Mr. Chairman, there are two policy judgments that are basically involved here. One had to do with the desirability of the engagement and the need to engage with those elements of the Libyan government with whom our Defense Department and state.
But they don't have any nuclear power plants there.
That's a decision that was made, a policy decision that was made, and I can point you to the letters on which I relied and the points that were made in those letters, but for reasons that are not clear to me, representatives of the Defense Department, the State Department are not here to respond.
So you're going to provide to
your question.
you're going to provide to both the Judiciary and the Oversight Committee all the letters articulating the need for Libyan nationals to be trained on nuclear sciences as well as the aviation.
The ones that I've seen, yes, sir.
And when will you provide those?
You have the two letters plus the third that was filed this week that made reference to that request.
I still don't understand for this committee why the driving need to train Libyan nationals on the nuclear sciences. Let me also ask you, Mr. Burson, why not issue a public notice and allow for a comment period?
As you know, Mr. Chairman, in the letter from Assistant Secretary de Valence to this committee, the decision on whether or not to apply the foreign policy exception which would preclude the need for a hearing, is a decision that is still under consideration, and no decision has been made, and the matter will be determined in due course.
I know it's not required in the regulation. Why not do it?
The matter's being considered, and
But
Secretary
you
Johnson...
listed out all the different agencies that are allowing comment period. Why not allow the American people? Why not allow the United States Congress? Why exclude them?
Mr. Chairman...
What's the harm?
I have no official authority to make the decision. I hear you, and I don't disagree personally, but my personal view is unimportant.
Who makes that decision?
The Secretary would make it in consultation with...
What sort of consultation have you been in with the White House?
The National Security Council is aware of the request that was made by the Defense Department, the State Department, and is also aware that DHS has decided that given that policy direction, we can adequately and will adequately protect the American people.
What's your viewpoint of the status? What's it like in Libya right now?
Libya is, as Dr. Wary described it, an unstable, dangerous, and insecure place. There's no question about that. That does not mean, from the standpoint of the Defense Department, the State Department, that we should stand back and not work with those people within the government that we can work with. Normalization does not mean secure, nor does it mean peaceful, nor does it mean halcyon. It means that we will engage.
So when we're doing these visa applications, you listed out a number of things that we look at in order to assess somebody's viability. And you talked about the big databases we have. How many Libyan criminal records do we have in our database?
Inside our databases, the FBI would not maintain criminal records unless it was collected as part of a previous case.
The answer is zero. How many of the?
It's not zero. With respectfully, sir, it's not zero. We'd have to find out.
When will you give me that number?
We will make inquiry because I can tell you as a former federal prosecutor, if there were a Libyan criminal case, we would have those records in our database.
I'm just wondering when you're going to give those to the committee. You said you have those. You can get those.
I will make inquiry. I don't have
how many
now.
Fingerprints, photos, terrorist screening center? I mean, part of the issue here is the fact that you don't have a fully functional host nation government. We have to deal with the fact that after a 40-year regime there under Muammar Gaddafi, they're not a functioning country at this point. You can't get to... Have you ever been to Libya?
I have not, sir.
As a member of Congress, I've been there twice. I couldn't even go to the eastern part of the country. And so if we're trying to assess an individual who comes from Darna or pick any place, how are we going to assess that? We can't even get there, let alone be able to work with the host nation government. There is no host nation government to work with.
I understand that, sir, and I understand that many of our diplomats and particularly our soldiers go to places that are very dangerous. You could add to the example of Libya, what's going on in Egypt today on occasions, what's going on in Yemen, what's going on as our soldiers are under attack.
It doesn't excuse or explain the idea that Libya is a very unique case. I see no urgency to try to get this through, particularly as it relates to the nuclear sciences. I wish the administration would work with Congress. I think we could probably figure something out. But what the administration has done is worked with a whole host of agencies except Congress. We send you a letter. Chairman Goodlatte sends you a letter. No response. And then we get some partial information back, didn't answer all of the questions, and we got to yank you up here for a hearing.
May I say in response to that, while we may disagree on many matters this afternoon, we do not disagree on the inexcusability of that late response. And I want to reiterate the apology that was contained in Secretary de Valence's letter. And I know, because it was included and you've been informed, that Secretary Jay Johnson now in his 100th day, together with his Chief of Staff, has put into place procedures that would not lead to that result. I again apologize.
I appreciate your sincerity. I'm 0 for 2 with him so far, but I do appreciate his leadership. I'm glad he's in that role. Look forward to working with him. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Utah, and the chair would now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney.
I basically think that Ms. Lofgren covered most of the ground on this perspective, but Secretary Pearson, let me just ask you, with respect to a review from an individual coming from Afghanistan to the United States, would their security check be the same as, less than, or more intensive than one for proposed process for Libyans?
It would be the same unless there were special condition, and then there would be the additional security checks and layers that would be applied.
How about Yemen?
Same answer.
Somalia?
Same answer.
Sudan?
Same answer.
Djibouti?
The same.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair would now recognize himself. Mr. Burson, I want to start by thanking you for your service as a federal prosecutor and tell you what you have probably already picked up on, which is that I'm a simple-minded guy. And I find myself in some instances having to piggyback on the equally simple-minded questions of Mr. Chaffetz. It strikes me that the prohibition would not have been put in place except for a desire to be punitive whenever the Reagan administration put it in place, right? It was designed and calculated to be punitive. So the lifting of it would be a reward. Is that fair?
Well, I would never refer to the chairman as simple-minded.
Everybody else does. It's okay.
But the decision, sir, respectfully, was because circumstances have changed and because after 9/11 we have a completely different approach to the way in which we look at how we vet people coming into this country.
I get that, but your position would be buttressed if this move were made more contemporaneous with 9/11. It's been quite some time since 9/11, and the move has not yet been made.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the fact is that the engagement with Libya began in the Bush administration. In 2003, 2004 is when Libya renounced terrorism and renounced its use of weapons. And President Bush sent an ambassador to Tripoli. In 2006, it was the Bush administration that removed Libya from the list of state sponsors of terrorism. So
I'm with you, and Mr. Chaffetz said that part of his frustration was that there had not been a lot of consultation with Congress, which is not your fault, but nonetheless, that is his perception. I want to tell you what my perception is, because you seem like somebody I'd be very pleased to have a conversation with about this. It strikes me that when you talk about normalization, or what kind of countries, to use your quote, Libyan government with whom we can do business. That was a quote that you used in response to another question. And it strikes me that a government with whom I would be interested in doing business would be a government that has some semblance of a civil or criminal justice system. So I understand that some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to go back to Benghazi, but it's tough. It'd be tough in my district to explain to people why a government that can't help us make a single solitary arrest in 18 months or a prosecution would be a government that we would trust to vet applicants to come to this country. Well, how is that analysis flawed?
Chairman, we don't trust the Libyans, or do we trust any other country to do the vetting that we're required to do under the law, and we do that. When we can, through the intelligence community or otherwise, receive information on people because of inquiries that are made, we take it. But this is a responsibility of our government to do this. With regard to the state, I admit and concur with you that Libya is in a very unstable place. Dr. Worry, I think, outlined the considerations quite directly. But I can tell you, as a vice president of Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization, that in fact there are many countries around the world, not only the ones that Mr. Tierney mentioned, but many countries that don't have the rule of law established. We do everything we can to help build the capacity for that, but it's a fact of life, so that when we invite someone to enter this country, it's got to be based on capacity and knowledge and data that we have.
Well, I'm not disagreeing with you there, but I do believe that having a normalized, whatever that definition may be, I'm not a diplomat, but whatever that definition is, a normalized relationship between our country and another country is a reward or a benefit to that country. It may also be a reward and a benefit to our country, but I would imagine that there are countries that want to have a better relationship with ours. And I don't think it's asking too much that we tell that country this is what we would like to see. And Benghazi leaps to mind. There was a school teacher that was murdered in Benghazi. It didn't get nearly the attention that our diplomats and our Stevens and Smith and Doherty and Woods got, but a teacher named Ronnie Smith was murdered in Benghazi. There have been no arrest. I've heard nothing about it. If you're going to seek a reward from this government, which is how I view this, then I would expect to see something on your behalf. And a stable criminal justice system which results in arrest and prosecutions would be something I would be interested in.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I would also welcome the opportunity to discuss this with you in the aftermath of the hearing. With regard to the suggestion you just made, I urge you to take that up with the State Department in a similar kind of discussion.
Oh, excuse me. The chair would now recognize Ms. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Doctor, I'm glad you're here today because it would appear that you have firsthand knowledge of the situation in Libya and have knowledge from a military perspective, why training Libyans may further security goals. What is your military expertise and how did that lead you to your understanding of U.S.-Libya military relationships?
19 years in the Air Force, 9 years active duty, 10 years in the reserves. I'm what's called a foreign area officer. I speak Arabic. I served for 2.5 months in Libya as the acting chief of security cooperation, where I was assisting the active duty defense attaché, essentially spearheading this nascent training effort in 2009 that included English language training to the Libyan military, C-130 maintenance. So it gave me a sense of the Libyan military, their structure, their weaknesses, their shortcomings.
Okay. You seem to be arguing that in order to maintain security within Libya, the central government needs a strong airlift capability. And currently the Libyans have minimal capability in that regard with both aging equipment and aging pilots. Is that correct?
That's correct. We're talking about systems that have fallen into real disrepair throughout the sanctions era. They're legacy U.S. systems. The pilots are aging. They need these systems really to project the government's authority over a very expansive country, to include border control, an issue that the international community cares about, to include securing oil facilities in the far south of the country. The roads are in disrepair. So we're really talking about giving the government and the military an essential military capability. Mm-hmm. And I should also add that the Air Force of Libya's institutions or of its military services is among the most coherent and most pro-Western elements in the country. I mean, Air Force officers defected en masse during the revolution. Entire air bases went over to the rebel side. These are Western-oriented officers. They could not have gotten to where they are in Libya's military if they were extremist or Islamist. Gaddafi made sure of that. So,
okay. So the airlift capabilities would help in maintaining security.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. And also you seem to be saying that in order to have a strong security force with airlift capabilities, DOD needs to be able to provide training to the Libyans. The current regulations, CFR 214.5, is hampering that training. Is that accurate?
That's accurate, yes.
Okay. And can the Department of Defense sufficiently train Libyans in Libya, do you think?
I believe they can. I mean, obviously, this is an international effort as well. We have to remember that many of our allies have also committed to helping Libya's military, the Turks, the British, the Italians. The UN is heavily involved, so it's really an international effort, and the Libyans, I think, welcome U.S. expertise, and they want this training.
So do you feel like they need to come to the U.S. for training, or not necessarily, or there are practical limitations of training Libyans in Libya?
Well, again, I think that's a question for the Department of Defense. My understanding, as was mentioned, that there are a number of cost issues and practicalities to having this training at a third country outside of of Libya certainly would be easier and more efficient to have it in the United States. So.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from Illinois. The chair would now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this hearing and the testimony of the witnesses here today. And I'd turn first to Dr. Wary and just inquire, your last trip into Libya was November 2013, and you talked about the presence of militia there. Hard to distinguish whether they were Islamic extremists or whether they were from other entities. Does the government of Libya have a full military and security presence in Benghazi?
They have a marginal presence. They have a special forces unit there. They have infantry. They do have regular army units. I mean, I visited the base of a Libyan military unit there in Benghazi. The problem is they're ill-equipped. They lack training. They lack essential communications. So they're competing with these other militias. So the way they control the city is by in some sense cooperating with these militias, and they can't push too hard against them.
Okay. Somewhat like Beirut then. Would that be similar? And have you traveled there?
It's a very, I think, rough and I think, frankly, crude analogy. I mean, you do have...
with Hezbollah standing on the streets in Beirut along with other... Okay, I'll just skip away from that and we'll focus on Benghazi for a moment. Do government security personnel, do they openly patrol the streets?
In places like Tripoli, yes.
Benghazi.
Yes, and in Benghazi they do. When I went to Benghazi, there were government military personnel at every checkpoint. They were out in force. The government has made an effort with what it has to patrol the streets. And I've visited the country 4 times since the revolution, and in each visit I've seen more and more uniformed police and military on the streets and less informal militias, technicals.
Tell me about your security detail there in Benghazi.
I'm sorry?
Your security detail in Benghazi, did you wear a bulletproof vest or a helmet? Or
I did not have a security detail.
Walk down the streets and you were
Yes.
anonymous enough that you didn't fear for your life? Okay. What about the operation of militia or, let's say, Islamic extremism in places like Tripoli that might come from places like Benghazi? Can you tell us about the instability in Tripoli?
It's not really an issue in Tripoli. Again, the Islamist presence is primarily, or the radical Islamist presence is primarily in the east, in Derna.
Didn't they once circle the parliament and shut down the parliament in Tripoli? And didn't that force come from Benghazi and not after the...
Part of it came from Benghazi. Part of it was from Misrata. It was actually a diverse coalition of interests. There were people from the south, people from the west. I spoke to many of these individuals about what they wanted. I actually talked to them about what they wanted. And they were not doing it out of an Islamic cause. They were pressing the government for certain infrastructural requirements. They believed they needed to use force. It was not an Islamic takeover of the parliament.
Okay, I appreciate you willing to take this risk and not the risk of testifying before Congress. That's relatively safe, but walking the streets of Benghazi is not. And I'd reflect upon, after hearing the testimony here, that this is a difficult question. We want to help stand up a security force and detail in Libya that will be our friend and our ally, that can project force into all of Libya and perhaps beyond if called upon to do that. I hear the testimony that if we're going to have a Libyan Air Force, we need to have personnel that are trained to take care of the maintenance on that and to get that Air Force in the air, but it's not practical to train them in Libya. And I don't know who's got the best answer to that question, but I would turn perhaps to Mr. Burson on that. Why is it not practical? Who testified to that? Was that you, Doctor? Who testified to that it's not practical to train them in Libya?
I did.
Okay, then I would direct the question to you, Doctor, please.
Well, again, I would defer the ultimate answer to that to the Department of Defense, they do the assessments, but my understanding is the actual air bases are in a state of disrepair. There are certain air bases and certain facilities that are, in fact, under the control of militias. They have not been turned over. So have the armories. And again, I think something I didn't mention was the fact that if you put U.S. personnel, boots on the ground, contractors, you introduce a dynamic, I think, that could undermine a lot of the goodwill that Libyans feel toward the United States right
Ms.
now.
Kephart, could you respond to that same question? Please, I watch my clock ticking down here.
The last part of your question was the practicalities of training the Libyans here in the United States? Yes?
Versus that in Libya, yes.
Right. I think the biggest problem you have is you've got no infrastructure really with the government right now that can provide border security in Libya. So you really don't know who your applicants are going to be. I think the infusion of a lack of intelligence about who you're actually dealing with is the big problem here. I think there's a concern about DOD and DOD being able to do its business, but the problem with this rule rescission is it's so broad that it could apply to anybody. And the militias that have been testified about here today all have access to those visas as well. So bringing them here creates the enforcement issues with immigration, all the other issues that you all have heard about multiple times.
I hear your testimony on that, and I appreciate it. I know the light is red, but I would ask unanimous consent to yield to the gentleman from Utah for 1 minute, or to the chairman at their choice. They're talking.
Will this be in lieu of a second round, would be my question to the gentleman from Utah?
I'd like to simply make a point if my colleagues are okay with that. I think they're overstating the security situation in Benghazi and Libya. I just wanted to inject in here, as you're talking about what it's like in Benghazi. Let's remember that Libya's first post-Gaddafi prosecutor was shot and killed. Let's also understand that the head of Libyan's military police was assassinated in Benghazi in October. Let's remember that our U.S. SEALs had to board a ship that had gone into the port there in eastern Libya. I mean, we're having to deploy SEALs to go over and take care of business over there. And for us to suggest that, hey, it's just getting better, and we see a few more police out there. Can anybody here name who is the prime minister of Libya? You can't, because he had to flee. This place is falling apart. The militias have over 8,000 people imprisoned. You've got another town in Libya where they had 40,000 people had to leave. You had an Indian doctor who was assassinated. Consequently, they have, according to press reports, 1,600 doctors have left the country. This place is falling apart. And we're over here trying to figure out how to get more Libyans into the United States to be trained on nuclear sciences. It doesn't add up. Yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Iowa and the gentleman from Utah. And the chair will now recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank both committees for joining together on an important question. And I believe that we do ourselves a disservice to come to a hearing like this with a closed mind. We recognize that part of the engine behind the decision, Mr. Person, is the reality of the small world in which we live. And the question is, do we turn our backs and utilize the turtle theory, or do we answer questions from members of Congress, legitimate questions about breach of security that would result in a terrorist act on our soil? I think that is what my friend from Utah is suggesting, that we would allow individuals into the United States unchecked and that they would perpetrate horrors because, one, they would not be tracked. So let me say to you that I think the premise of this repeal of this particular regulation has value. But I do think, as someone who has been in the region, is on Homeland Security, I think we've just seen each other recently, I recognize that our ultimate responsibility, I just got through interviewing on the question of Fort Hood and the issue of whether we can protect our soldiers on domestic soil. Our soldiers are not supposed to be armed. We are a civilian government. But whether or not we can protect against this potential of happening. So let me ask this question to you. The title of the hearing is provocative. It says that we're going to be training nuclear scientists. And that raises an ugly head that we're going to be training people who will use nuclear bombs to implode. Why don't you tell us what you think the impact of such a regulation will be? Is it your goal to bring over nuclear scientists? Can you kind of describe what kind of training and the level that individuals will be at. And then I'd like to ask Mr. Wayray, am I pronouncing your name right, sir?
Yes.
All right. And you were on the ground, and I want you, in fact, both of you to answer the question that I think has been asked, is what will be our checks and balances? What will be our screening process? And I asked Mr. Burson a larger question of the types of individuals that come up. Let me yield at this point.
Ms. Jackson Lee, the people that would be selected would not be a casual process. The Defense Department would select and vet those people who they would recommend apply for visas. That's correct. At that point, the whole panoply of screening mechanisms that I described in my testimony would apply to these particular individuals. So this would be a very carefully monitored and...
Would this be a crowd of thousands?
No, ma'am.
And so just say if we framed it in that way, you would expect what? Because we have done training in Egypt. Remember, that was a long-standing relationship that we had with the Egyptian military, of course, over the period of time, and certain other countries in the Mideast. We have the Saudis trained over here. So what level of size are we talking about?
I'm unable to give you a specific number, but you're talking about a manageable group, not numbering in the hundreds or the thousands that would be presumably affected.
And what would be the focus of tracking or maintaining the whereabouts of these individuals?
There are, in addition to the security measures that would be applied and the vetting procedures that would be applied before they would be permitted entry, there is a process called the SEVIS, which is the Student Exchange Visitor Information System that would actually require that a school continually update the status of that particular element. In addition, there would be the so-called Visas Mantis program that would be an especially rigorous security advisory opinion applied to those individuals.
Well, let me just say this, and I appreciate that. Being on Homeland Security, I know some of the fractures in that system. I'd want the Department of Defense to commit to a collaboration with Homeland Security for a definitive way of respecting the dignity of these individuals, but even beyond the CFIS process, because you're leaving it to colleges, and I think it would be very important. I think the process is important. Let me just ask this. Are you specifically training people to be nuclear scientists? Are you calling them over and saying, I want you to be a nuclear scientist, to be a bomb thrower?
I'm unable to identify any particular case and tell you what that particular person is, so I
So it's
can't
not,
respond.
the headline of the hearing says nuclear scientist. That is not the whole label of what you're doing.
Certainly not bringing over someone who doesn't know anything about atomic or nuclear physics. I think that's a fair assumption.
I didn't
Will
understand.
the gentlewoman yield?
I'd be happy to yield if I have the chairman unanimous consent to allow me to have Mr. Wayray answer my question and Mr. Burson to just answer the question. I'd be happy to yield. Ask unanimous consent.
Without objection.
All right, Mr. Burson, before I yield to the gentleman from Utah, what I was saying, Mr. Burson, are you saying that you don't know if they're going to be that, or you don't know the types of training or individuals? Is that what you're saying?
I am not familiar with any specific application of people who have applied or who would apply, or who the Defense Department may have identified as wanting to participate.
Okay, so it is no glaring announcement that it's just these nuclear scientists. That's what I wanted to make sure. Thank you. Mr. Wayray, and then I'll yield to the gentleman. My question was on the idea, you've been on the ground,
Sure.
and the idea of the value of having Libyan, I'll put the word students, but also the value of having them having some system of knowing who they are and where they are.
You may answer as quickly as you can.
That's absolutely essential, and I would defer to the Defense Department on that. I mean, they have to do the vetting, they have to do the screening. There are programs in place. My sense, again, I want to emphasize that this is about a partnership with a specific Libyan institution, the Air Force, that overwhelmingly has been pro-Western and supportive of U.S. objectives in that country.
And you would support that, the importance of that?
Absolutely, yes.
Gentlemen, I yield to the gentleman from Utah.
I think we're fine. Thank you. I think we're.
Oh, you getting your own time?
Yes, thanks.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chairman, let me just thank you very much and indicate in conclusion that we must be careful, but what we're trying to do is to reestablish government in Libya. That is of concern to the United States, homeland security, national security, and I think we have to be tough, but I think the door has to be opened carefully, cautiously, but we have to be responsible or responsive to trying to reconstruct a government. If that helps, we should do so. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from Texas. Chair will now recognize himself and the gentlelady from California for 5 minutes of closing remarks. I will go briefly and then yield to the gentleman from Utah. Dr. Wary, I want to thank you for your service to our military. I want to thank you, Mr. Shapiro, and you, Ms. Gephardt, for your service to law enforcement. I know yours, I believe, was active, and you were with the 9/11 Commission. And I want to thank you for your service as a federal prosecutor, which is very near and dear to my heart, and for your collegiality and expertise and comedy with a T among yourselves and with the members of the committee. And Mr. Burson, I would like to take you up on your opportunity to meet privately at your convenience, because if there's a leverage point by which we can impress upon the folks in Libya the importance of the civil and criminal justice system and bringing those to bear, not just Benghazi, but also the teacher. I'd love to talk to you about that. And with that, I would yield to the gentleman from Utah.
I thank you. I thank all the panelists here. But to address what the gentlewoman from Texas brought up, the reason it's bringing nuclear scientists into the title of this hearing is the fact that, based on what during the Reagan administration did in 1983, the Department of Homeland Security is looking to rescind a prohibition of bringing Libyan nationals who are engaged in or seeking to obtain studies or training in aviation maintenance, flight operations, or nuclear-related fields. That's what they're trying to rescind. The prohibition is there right now. And what's very telling about the answer is, you know of no person, there's not one person that you're aware of that's trying to come here to get trained on nuclear sciences, yet we're spending all this time and energy, all this effort to try to rescind it. And again, it begs the question that it sounds like is best answered by the Department of Defense and the Department of State as to the driving need to bring a Libyan national to the United States to train on nuclear sciences. That is what's mystifying to me. I would hope that you would carry back to the senior management, including the White House, but certainly within Homeland Security. I think it would be prudent to allow public comment and to allow the public a notice and then public comment, and to better inform Congress of what you're trying to do. If there's a driving need, then I want to hear it. But we've gone through this entire hearing, and I don't think anybody has adequately explained in this hearing on why we need to train Libyan nationals on nuclear sciences. It just mystifies me.
Would you yield just for a moment?
Sure.
This is just a moment. You just said what all of us are saying, which is, which the State Department, I believe, is doing well, and I think the Defense is doing well, is that they will generate answers to these questions that you have, and we should allow those answers. And finally, you're reading a 30-year commentary by under President Reagan. The gentleman from the State Department indicated that he has no known knowledge of the level of individuals that will come. I think we are really recognizing that we have to do something to rebuild that government, and the United States is very much a player in that.
Reclaiming my time. I don't think bringing people in to train them on nuclear sciences when they have no nuclear power plants is where we would start. We need some basic rule of law. The gentleman is from the Department of Homeland Security, not from the Department of State. I would also ask and part of the reason we're having this hearing here today is that Chairman Goodlatte and I did issue a letter asking for a response and explanation, of which we didn't get an answer, and I appreciate the gentleman's apology to that effect. I would like to ask Mr. Burson, under Executive Order 12866, the Department of Homeland Security is required to provide the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs numerous assessments regarding needs, costs, and benefits, among other items, in writing regarding to this rescission. Have you done that?
I would have to confirm that. I have seen OMB, Office of Management and Budget documents to that effect, so I believe so, but I would have to confirm that, Mr. Chair.
Would you commit to providing those to this committee, these committees?
Yes, sir.
And when would we, what's a reasonable?
I should say, because I was a fair lawyer at one point, subject to whatever privileges.
Fair and lawyer are not very often used in the same sentence, but I get what you're saying. I remind the chairman from South Carolina that I am not an attorney.
Quit apologizing.
I thought I was bragging, but we would certainly appreciate if you would provide those to these committees, and I do appreciate your perspectives on this. We obviously care about this and would like more information. Thank you.
Thank you, gentleman from Utah. And now recognize the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief. I do think that we have managed to surface some useful information here today. I think key to this issue is whether we're going to use the tools available to us to benefit our country, or whether we're just going to use a blunt instrument that could do harm to our country. That's really the question before us. And when I think about normalized relations doesn't mean that you have a relationship with a country that's normal. You think about the countries that we maintain some kind of connection with when it's advantageous to us. In Colombia, they assassinated the Supreme Court. The drug cartels tried to take over the entire country. But we did not say no one from Colombia can ever come to the U.S., even though they were, a basket case at the time, because, there were things that we need to do. And in fact, we have helped Colombia turn the corner and defeat the drug cartels. And part of that was training their people. And, it's a success story. It's not over with yet, but, they're in much better shape than they were. And I think this hopefully could be a similar situation. I do think that it's a legitimate question of why would we have study in the nuclear field. I think it's worth pointing out that Libya, as a former nuclear power, has weapons scientists there. They have nuclear weapons scientists in the country, or they did at one time. Historically, we have sought to take weapons scientists from potential enemies and teach them something useful to do other than weapons scientists, because if that's all you know how to do, that skill is for sale in the world. And if you have something useful to do with that level of information, it's much safer for the United States. I would note also that we're not asking to repeal the deemed export rule. And for those of you who are not aware of this, the deemed export rule means that if you've got sensitive information and you've got a foreign national, they can't actually study that because it is deemed that you're exporting that sensitive information to a nation, hence the name deemed export rule. So this would seem to preclude, I would think, bringing in new scientists to learn how to make new weapons. But I think we would like to follow up with the department, kind of what the intentions are, and if it really matches what I've described here, which I think, so far as I've been able to learn, it does. And Mr. Burson, can you?
Ranking Member Lofgren, I want to point out that after we've been talking about the Department of State and the Department of Defense, but actually the Department of Energy actually also weighed in for precisely the reason you suggest. And I'd have to get you the date when this began, but they started a Libyan scientist engagement program precisely on this notion that there are nuclear scientists in Libya as a result of the Gaddafi years, and it's in our interest to see that they get gainful employment that's not hostile to us.
Right. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you, and I would yield back my time and go meet the people who are massing in my office for a meeting.
I thank the gentlelady from California. Before we adjourn, I would ask unanimous consent to move two things in the record. One is a statement from our colleague, Mr. Bentivolio, and the other is an article by Patrick Cockburn entitled 3 Years After Gaddafi, Libya is Imploding into Chaos and Violence. With that, this concludes today's hearing. Thanks to all the witnesses for attending. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional questions for the record. for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. With that, this hearing is adjourned.